Good afternoon. My name's Don Norris. I'm chair of the Department of Public Policy and director of the Maryland Institute for Policy Analysis and Research at UMBC. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Social Science Forum this afternoon, in which we will have a post-mortem of the recently held election, both here in these United States and in the lovely blue state of Maryland. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping before I get started, though. And mention that this is part of the Social Sciences Forum series. There are brochures like this laying around. You might want to pick them up, and they will tell you what the next forums are. Indeed, the next one tonight at 7 o'clock here in the library is Practical Idealists Bringing the World to Baltimore. A little bit about our forum today. We are going to have 4 speakers. I will introduce them momentarily in the order in which they will speak. Each one will speak, 12 to 15 minutes. We're going to leave a good half hour for questions from the audience after we have finished. We're going to be focusing on both the national election and the election here in Maryland. After each speaker concludes his or her remarks, the next speaker will speak. Please hold your questions till the end so that we don't take up too much time during the actual presentations. Our first speaker is Stuart Rothenberg, sitting on the far left of the table. He is the editor and publisher of the Rothenberg Political Report, a nonpartisan political newsletter covering the U.S. House, Senate, and gubernatorial campaigns, presidential politics, and political developments. He is also a twice-a-week columnist for Roll Call, Capitol Hill's premier newspaper. Welcome, Stuart Rothenberg. Next is our own Thomas Schaller, Associate Professor of Political Science at UMBC, a weekly political columnist for Baltimore Sun. He has published numerous commentaries on a variety of publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Baltimore, the Boston Globe, and a variety of others. And he is the author of Whistling Past Dixie, How Democrats Can Win Without the South. Tom? Welcome, Thomas Schaller, please. Next is Julie Bykowicz, a reporter with the Baltimore Sun. Since Julie's first day as a political reporter for the Sun in January of 2009, these days coincided with Mayor Sheila Dixon's indictment and the start of the Maryland General Assembly. Welcome to Maryland, Julie. She focuses on coverage of state agencies, and also she was one of the 2 State House reporters during this current election season. She has written about the death penalty, about slots, about speed cameras, and a variety of other topics. She began political reporting after more than 7 years on the Baltimore Sun's crime desk. She lives in Baltimore, works primarily out of Annapolis. Welcome, Julie. We'll lead off with Stu Rothenberg.
Thank you. Should I do it from here?
You can even do it from there or up here, Stu.
Can you see me back there? Maybe you're better off if you can't see me. I don't know. I kind of think it'd be better if I stand up. What do you think?
Yeah.
You want to go over there?
Not really, but
Okay.
I will.
That's fine. No, you're good where you are.
Thanks, Don, for my first song. Moon River. No. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, when you hear somebody's going to talk about politics and going to tell you what happened, you probably think they're going to tell you what you're supposed to think. I really don't care what you think. I am a handicapper, so all I do is kind of do the rundown on who won and who lost and why, and you decide whether you like it. You decide whether it makes you happy, whether it makes you angry, sad, afraid. Deal with it one way or another. I'm not pushing an agenda, and I'm not pushing a party here. So I have about 10 or 15 minutes, and we're going to do a little bit on what happened and why, and then what it means. Oh, and as a handicapper, one thing that I do that most other people don't do is I actually sit and I interview candidates during an election. So we probably interviewed 150 House and Senate candidates this election for about an hour each one. Who are they? What do their parents do? How do they make a living? What are their positions on the issues? How much money have they raised? Things like that. And at the end, I have a sense on who these people are, so I can talk a little bit about that. Okay, quickly what happened. Elections are about who votes and how they vote, and those are two different things, but they're both really important. And of course, why they vote is another issue. In terms of who voted, this electorate in a midterm election was different than the presidential election 2 years ago, and that in part accounts for the Republican victory. So if you look at the traditional demographic factors, this election was, this electorate in the midterm was not nearly as African American as it was 2 years ago. That's not surprising. Barack Obama on the ballot brought out a substantial number of African American voters who were excited and energized by his candidacy. So African Americans constituted 13% of the electorate 2 years ago. This time only 10% of the electorate. In addition, these voters, what is it now, 2 weeks ago, were significantly older than during the last presidential election. Young people did not vote. Voters 18 to 29. Not a surprise. Traditional pattern. Young voters turn out at a much higher rate in a presidential election because it's more exciting, gets more publicity, it's a bigger deal. And in a midterm election, young people go back to do what they normally do, whatever that is. I don't really want to think about that. So that voters 18 to 29 constituted 18% of the electorate 2 years ago. This time, 11%. But you know who went up in terms of participation? Old folks. So the old folks in the audience ought to feel proud. Voters 65 and older. 65 and older. 2 years ago constituted 16% of the electorate. This time, 23%. Almost a quarter of all voters were 65 and older. So it was this electorate was whiter and older. It was significantly more Republican. Not surprisingly then, Republicans did better. They did better with another group as well, independent voters. Now, many people identify as either Republican or Democrat, but some as independents. Some independents are closet partisans. They're not really independent. They just tell me they're independent because I think they think that I'll think that they're smarter. Are you a Democrat or Republican? Oh no, I'm independent. I look at the candidate. I look at the issues. Then I decide. Well, some of them actually do that. Many of them are vote Republican or Democratic anyway, but some of them truly are independent. Now these independent voters are very important. They constitute often quarter, 30% of the electorate, but they're crucial because the true independents in this group swing back and forth. Now, they're not motivated strongly by issues or party or ideology, because if they were, they'd be either Republicans or Democrats. So they tend to be more casual about politics. I mean, I spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year worried about politics, what's going on in the news, and what some politicians say. But I don't have a real life. Independents have a real life, and they spend it on normal things. Mowing the lawn, going out to buy a new suit, getting a babysitter, whatever. They have real lives. So what motivates them, this important group that constitutes maybe 310 voters? Well, it's mostly, how do you feel? How are things going? Ed Koch, the former mayor of New York, used to ask this question of, how am I doing? So to independent voters, it's, how are things going? And right now, independent voters, like many other voters, think the country's not headed in the right direction. So they voted for change. So you had the combination of strong Republican voters dissatisfied with the Obama agenda, health care, cap and trade, stimulus spending, and then you had independent voters concerned about a lack of jobs, a sense that things haven't turned around, things haven't changed in Washington. You combine those two things, and you get a dramatic electorate that comes out and votes for Republicans, for change, and against Barack Obama, and against Nancy Pelosi. Who are these people that got elected? So one of them is named Bobby Schilling. He's a congressman from Western Illinois, northwestern Illinois, Rock Island, across the river from Davenport, Iowa. He comes in, said, have you ever run for office before? No. Have you ever contributed money to a candidate before? No. Have you ever been involved in Republican Party politics before? No. I'm thinking, what's he doing here now? Why is he running for office? So what motivated you? He said, well, 3 months into the Obama administration, I realized they were taking the country off.
May I have your attention, please? Frank Harrison to the first floor. Frank Harrison to the first floor, please.
They were driving the car off the cliff. We're going to pile up all this debt, all this bigger government, all this mandates for health care coverage. They're interfering in individual rights. We got to do something. I've got to run. So I went home, talked to my wife. We prayed. I decided to run. Wow. I said, okay, what kind of business do you have? He said, I own a pizza place in Rock Island called St. Giuseppe's Heavenly Pizza. I think, well, I hope this is generating a lot of cash because it's expensive to run for Congress. So I said, do you have a family? Yes. How many children? 10. Wow. Now I'm thinking he better generate a lot of cash if he's going to feed this family and run for Congress. The pizza place, 80% takeout, so it's not a fancy sit-down restaurant, closes on Sunday so he can be with his family, and the other employees can be with their family. And you're getting a picture on who this is, a guy who's never been involved, a man of considerable faith, spirituality, driven to run for office because he thinks the country is headed off a cliff. 2 days later, I see another guy, a dentist from Arizona, Paul Gosar. Same kind of deal. Have you ever run for office? No. Ever contributed? No. Ever been involved in Republican Party politics? No. Do we go through the exact same kind of thing? I said, you're a dentist, so you must be rich. Lord knows Mike, the dentist in my family, probably has 3 summer homes, given the business we've given him. He says, no, I'm not rich. I have a practice in a relatively poor part of town, and I said, well, okay, so how are you still being a dentist? Are you still seeing your patients and running for office at the same time? And he said, oh, no. I said, well, do you have partners who are running the practice? Oh, no. I sold my practice to run for Congress. I'm all in on this. And I thought, holy cow. You sold your business to run for Congress. Well, he won, and Bobby Schilling won, and a number of these guys. So the question is, how do these people who previously weren't involved in politics, how do they behave when they get to Washington? When I asked them to compare themselves with the class of 1994, which some of you may remember was a big Republican wave class, Newt Gingrich, we're going to change Washington, change the way things work. They said to me, we have the same values, instincts, goals that those people did, but there's a big difference. They went to Washington and they sold out. They became part of the system. They voted for earmarks. They voted to spend money back in their states to try to get elected. They became part of the Washington problem. We won't. We are more principled. We won't compromise. We won't sell out. The folks back home expect us to do no less. And you have this whole Tea Party phenomenon where these people who are elected are concerned with what's going on back home, and not even Tea Party people. I talked to a longtime former Republican senator, Dan Coates, came in, who is he's conservative, but he's not a Tea Party person. He's from Indiana, rather an establishment conservative, wouldn't you say, Dan Coates? And I asked him, have you done anything with the Tea Party? Oh, yes, I go to all their events. Absolutely. And everybody is concerned that the Tea Party will be a force that will be judging them every day on every vote, and they have to be very careful. And some of these people, of course, will be running in 2 years. So what does this mean? And as I take a couple more minutes and sum up here, for the Republicans, there's this question of how the different wings work together, how the people who've been on Capitol Hill, who understand process, who understand legislation involves compromise, how do they deal with these new folks? These people who just haven't been involved in politics and have gotten involved because they think they need to save the country. Can a Republican leader like Congressman John Boehner, who is likely to be the new speaker, can he balance these two groups? Can he keep the energy and excitement of this freshman class, which wants change, change, change? And can he direct it in a way so that Republicans don't look like they want to blow everything up and start over again? Many of them do want to blow things up and start over again, but the American public tends not to like to have things exploded They prefer some changes, but they prefer some reasonable change. And on the other side, how are the Democrats going to figure out after this election, where they suffered substantial losses, particularly in the South and the Midwest, and Democrats lost who voted with the president and who voted against the president. 3 Democrats were defeated who voted against stimulus, against cap and trade, and against health care reform. 3 Democrats voted against all 3 of the big Democratic items. Bobby Bright of Alabama, Walter Minnick of Idaho, and Gene Taylor of Mississippi. They voted exactly like their constituents wanted. They voted like Republicans because they come from very conservative and Republican constituencies, just like many of these Democrats who lost. And the voters said, we don't care, you're out of here, you're fired, even though they voted, quote unquote, correctly the way the voters wanted. Why? Because there was such pent-up anger, particularly in Republican areas of the country, Republican districts, that those voters said, maybe you're voting the right way, but we got to change Washington, and the only way we can do that is by sweeping all you guys out. This is not this might strike you as very radical. It's not that radical. It happened 4 years earlier, in 2006, when moderate to liberal Republicans were swept out of their congressional offices, their districts, by voters who said, yes, we like you, Congressman Jim Leach of Iowa. You are a very moderate to liberal Republican, but I'm sorry, you've got to go because we've got to change Washington. So now the question is how the Democrats behave. Do they figure out a way to convey to the American public that they understand that something has to be different in Washington, but at the same time remind their base voters, liberals in the party, don't worry, we're not going to sell out. We're not going to cave in to those Republicans just because they won an election. We're going to fight them head on. And finally, how does the White House react? There's no doubt that that this election was partially about the president and partially about Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The president now has to figure out what previously, when he had super majorities in the House and the Senate, he could simply decide what he wanted to do and pursue an agenda. And actually there's been some significant criticism both from all sides as to whether he did that adequately. The president achieved something remarkable if you think about it, absolutely remarkable. Republicans think that the president is a socialist who wants to take over the American economy and fundamentally transform American society. Liberal Democrats think the president was insufficiently aggressive in pushing the public option on health care. The stimulus was too small. Why didn't he push don't ask, don't tell when he had the option? The Democrats initially were pushing what's called the Employee Free Choice Act, which is a labor position, and yet they didn't even get to that. So liberals, the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party, thinks that in fact the president was too modest and moderate. Somehow, Barack Obama has succeeded in ticking off both the right and the left. And now the question is, where does he go from here that he's in an even more difficult position, a more awkward position, with his party left saying, don't you dare compromise to those Republicans, and others in the party saying, see what happens when we don't compromise, when we look too extreme, too liberal? It's a difficult position. I expect we'll have a couple of years of significant partisanship gridlock, not in the near future. The next 2 or 3 months, there'll be a lot of nice talking and flirting with the parties, flirting with one another, as they try to prove to you and to the American public that they got the message, that they want to work together. But there's a huge gap in terms of values, priorities, and ideals in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and I think we're headed for a significant stalemate ahead. Thank you.
Oh no, this is the bad microphone with the reverb on it. Maybe we can let me have your mic on. Yeah, because this mic is the battery. It's making it terrible.
Okay. The problem is
Using a short leash. That's all right. I just didn't want to have to stand up.
Tom Schaller's on a short leash now.
Yeah, amazing. Right. Maybe this for Julie.
You want to stand over the other side of the stairs?
Sure. You want me?
No, that's fine. You're good. You're good right there. You're good right there.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, on behalf of the university, on behalf of Don, of course, and Julie, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to have Stuart Rothenberg here. And he took a lot of time out of a busy schedule. This is sort of the high season for him in the post-election period to come up here, drive from the Baltimore suburbs. We're blessed that his wife teaches here. I used every possible means of guilting him into coming here, pro bono, to talk to us at a time when, not to embarrass him, normally to get Stuart Rothenberg in a room is going to cost you travel expenses, meals, and a pretty nice honorarium. So for him to do this today.
You mean that's not part of the deal?
Yeah, I can write you a check on my personal accounts too, but it's not going to be worth your time either. I don't know if you know what the state university professors are making.
I'm married to one.
Oh, that's true. Well, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let me add a few things to what Stu said without sort of stepping on his toes too much. I think, and if you read my column today, where Stu started out is where I started out. My column today in the Baltimore Sun is entitled "Revenge of the Retirees," and I think it's fundamentally an election where, though not wholly explained by, the shifting demographics, not necessarily in the country per se, but the shifting demographic nature of the two electorates in 2008 and 2010. As Stu pointed out, you have seniors jumping from 16% to like 22% of the electorate, and those under 30 falling from 18% to 12% of the electorate. And those seniors voted about 53% for McCain. They were the only age demographic that McCain carried in 2008. They jumped up to close to 60% voting for Republican congressional candidates. And when you do the crosstabs on that, when you multiply 21% times 60%, and you multiply only 16% 18 years ago times 53%, that means seniors voting Republican were about 8% of the total electorate in 2008, and they were close to 15% of the total electorate in 2010. You think, well, that's only a 7-point difference, but it's basically a doubling. And when you're trying to get to 50, 51, 52%, starting at the 15-yard line to get to midfield is a lot better than starting at your 8-yard line. And so that, this sort of generational component of this election, I find most fascinating, particularly in response to, as I put it in the column, the first not only African-American president in American history, but the first president born after the midpoint of the 20th century, after 1950, no less after 1960. Obama was born in 1961. And so I think what you're seeing here is a generational clash over the attentions and scarce resources of a government that, yes, is overstrapped and probably spending beyond its means, but different ideas about how to spend and what to spend on, and frankly, whom to spend on. We had a healthcare reform package that I think, among the issues this year, was probably most detrimental, was seen as a government overreach, a commitment that we can't make at a time when unemployment's at 10%, and when you look at the people who no longer are filing for unemployment, the effectively unemployed is probably closer to 16 or 17%. That came as a huge shock, and Rahm Emanuel, who is now no longer the chief of staff, fought against the president. He said, we can't do this right now politically. And the president, whatever you may think of him, said, we're going to do it because I have the political capital to do it. And he did, though very barely able to get that through after a lot of false starts in the Congress and particularly on the Senate side. So Obama, in some senses, risked his presidency on the health care initiative and to a certain degree the stimulus package. And he may well be a one-term president as a result of that. And as Stu said, whatever you think about that you can look at that as a noble endeavor, or you can look at that as political stupidity, and maybe it's a little bit of both. But in either case, he not only cost his party a majority in one chamber of Congress, and probably pretty soon in 2012, with that big class of 2006 senators that the Democrats have to defend, will probably cost them the Senate in 2012, but may also cost him a chance to get reelected. So that's what I'd say about the electorate. Let me turn to the issues next, and then I'll talk about who got elected, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Tea Party, and then I'll be quiet. I think Obama really was on the ballot. This is a pretty typical phenomenon in the postmodern sort of electoral period that midterm elections are not always, but sort of primarily a referenda on the current occupant of the White House. That was true in 2006, certainly, and even in 2002, when the Republicans did pretty well, despite the fact that presidents normally lose seats in midterm elections. And to a lesser degree, though, certainly in those House and Senate races, a referenda on Pelosi and Reid's leadership. I mean, Pelosi was featured, I think more than Harry Reid, but Pelosi was featured in a whole spate of ads run either by candidates or by independent expenditure groups, just essentially demonizing her, and much in the way that the Democrats did with Tom DeLay and George Bush. And so what was interesting is that Bush is still second to Wall Street in terms of the blame of the economy, but Bush is not around anymore. And we rarely have 3 anti-incumbent elections in a row, and we did in 2006, 2008, and 2010, which benefited the Democrats when the incumbent party and the incumbent image was really George W. Bush in 06 and 08. And now, in 2010, the shoe is on the other foot, and the anti-incumbent message is obviously being directed at the president, the soon-to-be ex-speaker, and Harry Reid, who did survive. You know, I think those three big congressional votes, as I mentioned, one is the stimulus, two is cap and trade, although I think only the House voted on that, and the third, of course, is the health care. That did a lot of damage, and I find it interesting, and Stu is exactly right. Obama has become this national Rorschach test, which, you know, he's a socialist, communist, Marxist who's trying to turn us into a confiscatory Soviet state if you're a Republican or a conservative Republican. And not only, you know, has he, you know, disaffected liberals on issues like, you know, gay marriage and don't ask, don't tell. I mean, liberals think he was insufficiently hard on Wall Street. And so liberals think he's a corporate sellout. Now, those two things cannot both be true, right? But they're not helping him. And the irony here is that the people in the middle and the independents should therefore be happy of both, you know, sort of extreme elements of the national political culture. The sort of conservative right and the super liberal left are mad at the president. You would think independents and moderates should be cheered by him, but they're not happy either. And I think in the end, you know, what washes all of this out is ultimately the unemployment rate. I mean, if the president and the White House hadn't promised that the stimulus would bring unemployment down to 8%, I think things would have still been bad, but the fact that they spent that money and didn't get it made it even worse. And if it had come down to 8 or 7%, I think the Democrats would have held on to the House and probably a couple more Senate seats and a few more governors. You know, and if it's still at 10% 2 years from now, I think Obama will lose. If it's coming down to 7 or 8% and it looks like the economy's turning around, I think he'll probably win. So unemployment sort of washes out a lot of this, I think. And, you know, when Stu talked about those issues, I think one of the things we looked at, there were 49 McCain Democrats, Democrats who won in 2008 in districts that McCain carried, including our own Frank Cradleville here on the Eastern Shore, who won with one of the widest margins for a McCain victory. I think McCain carried his district by 23 or 25 points. I think 36 of those 49 got taken out, basically 3/4 of them. So those were people in sort of dangerous districts, particularly in the Midwest and to a lesser degree the South. Yeah, the other irony here on the issues is that when people were asked who was most to blame for the state of the economy, Wall Street finished first. George W. Bush finished second and Obama finished third. And so if you're really upset with Wall Street and George W. Bush, the Republicans, for ruining the economy, it seems ironic that you would rush to put the Republicans back in charge of the House, a party that's, though the Democrats certainly have their own Wall Street connections, is certainly not unfamiliar with Wall Street and its contributions. On a related note, and if you're going to be taking Poly 100 from me in the spring, you know, I'm assigning Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson's new book, which basically argues that part of the reason that the decline of middle class is in part because Democrats have become a highly corporatized party in the post-union era, and I think there's some truth to that. So I think there was some legitimate backlash against Obama not being sufficiently tough on Wall Street. I think when you look back at some sort of explanation for this pan-populism, this left populism and right populism, what could have brought those two elements together? I think, frankly, even if it was just kind of show trial-y, I think Obama needed to a couple heads needed to roll. And I think they wanted to see the president, who's a calm and cool character, I think they wanted to see his back get up a little bit. I think they wanted to see his teeth in more than a toothy grin. I think they wanted to see him go after somebody. Dramatically, because people are angry and they're going to swing, you know, those fists of frustration at somebody. And if you're not going to do anything as the President of the United States, those punches are eventually going to land on your chin, and I think they did 2 weeks ago. Thirdly, let's talk a little bit about the electorates. I don't know, I'm good on time. What was interesting about this election was a lot of people were talking about it being the year of the woman, sort of a second year of the woman after 1992, and I think that was true to a certain degree. Some even calling it more specifically the year of the conservative or Republican woman, and there's some truth to that. In primaries for Congress, women running in the Democratic primaries actually did much better. They won like 40% of the races in which they were, whereas only about 25% of Republican women ran. So actually at the primary level, it was a better year for Democratic women. But at the general election level, there were quite a significant number of Republican women elected in a party that, of course, has been losing the women's vote for the better part of 20 years now. And so that bodes well for the Republican Party if they can both attract women candidates and, in theory, by extension, attract women voters back, because they don't do very well among women voters. And so, you know, I think this is just a good testament to the changing you know, gender dynamics in the country. But you had women versus women general elections in the governor's race in New Mexico, and the governor's race in Oklahoma, the Stephanie Herseth Sanders, is it Kristi Noem or Noem, like Alaska? Kristi Noem in the South Dakota at-large House seat. All three of those won by Republicans, but more to the point, you were going to get a woman winning that seat because the two finalists, so to speak, were both women. And then regionally, which, you know, obviously I have some vested interest in that, and the Democrats took a beating in the South, but really took a beating in the Midwest. I mean, losing 7 state legislatures across the Midwest, losing 5 or 6 governors, and several Senate seats. I think the big surprise is that Obama loses his old Senate seat in Illinois in a pretty blue state. Granted, it's a red year, but that's the kind of state that if Democrats are losing Illinois, that's a serious problem. It sort of harkens back to what we saw in the big electoral story of the early part of the year, which was the Scott Brown victory in a decidedly blue state, Massachusetts, which nevertheless elected Deval Patrick to a second term. Finally, the Tea Party. You know, I don't know what to think of the Tea Party, perfectly honest with you. Is it just a subset of conservative voters repackaged with a new brand and a new name? There's some truth to that. Is it recycled Rand Paulian, Ron Paul, sort of iconoclastic small government libertarians? There's some evidence to that. Is there an evangelical component to that? There is some evidence to that if you read you know, the new book out by Sarah Posner and Addie Stan and others who've interviewed Tea Partiers and so forth. So it's hard to get a grip on it, and the Tea Party is actually 5 different organizations, and there's some sense that it's being funded by the Koch brothers with their millions of dollars because they're really against, you know, cap and trade, and there's other senses that it's a sort of a starfish, as Jonathan Rauch wrote in the National Journal, a horizontally oriented organization that is really bottom-up and grassroots, and I think there's probably some truth to that. I think it started as a bottom-up organization, and then strategic Republicans and conservative interests realized they could put a lot of money behind it, and so it's going to be interesting to see the intramural fights. And so my general sense of it is that the Tea Party's impact was far greater at the primary stage than the general stage. Stu might disagree with me. Taking down you know, incumbents, including one that came back to win only the 2nd write-in race in American history for a U.S. Senate seat, and Lisa Murkowski, Strom Thurmond being the first, taking down incumbents like, you know, Mike, or at least establishment favorites like Mike Castle in Delaware, costing the Republicans a seat there. So my sense is that they are having, as any sort of movement to change national politics has to sort of happen first within your party. We saw this with the, whatever you want to call it, the blogger left in the middle part of the decade in the D movement, people saying, look, the Democratic Party sounds too much like the Republican Party. We need to change. We need to change our focus. We need to talk about different issues. We need some new blood. We need some new faces. And there was an intra-party challenge there, which ultimately helped the Democrats in 2006 and 2008, despite the naysayers in 2003, 2004 saying you're ruining the party, you're going to take it too far to the left. That's not true. And again, look, this Tea Party revolution ultimately probably helped the Republicans. And, you know, a party has to sort of work out its internal issues before it goes public, in a sense. And so I think those internal machinations are not done yet. And there are some places where the Republican Party is damaged by the Tea Party, particularly in blue states like Delaware. But, you know, in Rubio in Florida in that race, or, you know, I would say the other one is probably Sharon Angle probably hurt. The prime candidate target, since Nancy Pelosi was going to be safe, and Harry Reid, who escaped. You know, maybe you need a different candidate there. But in strong red states like Kentucky, Rand Paul, or Florida, which is kind of a blue-purple state, but tends to trend red, you know, nominating a Tea Party candidate ultimately didn't hurt the Republicans in the general election, at least not in this cycle. And so they are going to have to be taken into account. And national Republican politicians are, I mean, some more than others, like Jim DeMint, are taking them more seriously than other politicians, including, interestingly, Karl Rove and Ed Gillespie and some others who seem very, very wary about this movement because they can't really get a handle on it, and it may, in some senses, undermine or, you know, sort of challenge their, you know, insider Republican establishment power base. But I think that's going to be a fascinating story to watch as we move ahead, and I'm probably over time, so let me.
Right.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello. So nothing that you just heard applies in Maryland. We're just a completely different state than what shaped up nationally, and Don will talk to you, I think, a little bit about why that is, but let me first just explain some of the nitty-gritty of what happened. Maryland, very Democratic state, more than twice as many registered Democrats as Republicans. There's always been talk that that's not a true picture of the party makeup in the state because there's a thinking that people register as Democrats just so that they can participate in the Democratic primary. which is where a lot of races, particularly in Baltimore City and in Montgomery County and in Prince George's County, are decided. But nevertheless, more than a 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican advantage, and it's very difficult for statewide Republicans to overcome that. In fact, in a generation, we've only had that happen once at the governor's level, and that was with Governor Bob Ehrlich. So taking it to the race that we just experienced, it was quite interesting to have that same successful Republican try again in what is, as we just heard, a very Republican-friendly year nationally. I know reporters were pretty excited about that because in Maryland, frankly, a lot of races can be very boring to cover. And the idea that maybe a Republican could succeed was an interesting thing to cover. So the race really got started in about April when Ehrlich made it clear that he would challenge Governor Martin O'Malley for his job back. And then we proceeded all through the summer where poll after poll showed the two of them in a pretty tight race. And it wasn't just one source of polling, it was basically every type of poll that you can imagine. When it really looked at likely voters, the race was in a dead heat. And that really didn't start to shift until early fall. And then sort of after the primary election, O'Malley seemed to break away and just be unbeatable, which he was. So we ended up in a Republican year where a popular, successful Republican governor who lost to O'Malley 4 years ago by 6.5 percentage points actually lost by more than double that amount this year. I'm very interested to hear Don's thoughts on that. And then just to give you a quick overview of some of the other statewide races and the other, the other legislative races across the state, our entire Maryland General Assembly was up for re-election. It's 188 seats. And again, in a Republican year, Republicans lost 2 state Senate seats, and they only picked up 5 House seats. So just all across the state, it didn't really sort of translate, the voter anger that we saw nationally just didn't translate here seemingly at all. There is one exception to that, which is something I'm looking at now. It seems like there is sort of a red or Republican undercurrent bubbling up in local governments, and 4 counties actually flipped from Democratic control to Republican control, and Republicans picked up seats all across the state, I think something like 40 local seats. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out in future years, because it's sort of a farm team for statewide politicians, these local offices. As far as the Tea Party, which was something that was nationally very interesting, it didn't quite seem to get off the ground here, although we did have a Tea Party candidate for governor in the primary election. That was Brian Murphy. Seemed to come out of nowhere, just had never been involved in politics at all. He was an investor who had a bakery, Smith Island Bakery, with those really fattening, fancy cakes. And young, 32 or 33, with a big family, no previous connection to politics as far as we could tell. And he did gain some attention because Sarah Palin backed him and did robocalls on his behalf and supported him. So he was able to sort of peel away about 1/4 of the Republican vote in the primary. And there's some thought that maybe that weakened Bob Ehrlich in the general election. Not sure how true that is, because I don't think that Republicans would sit at home in this election, but there may be something to that. So the other 2 statewide races that we had this year, one was a non-starter. It was the Maryland Attorney General, Doug Gansler. He's a Democrat. You've probably heard of him. He's pretty good with the publicity. He's pretty good at getting his name out there. In fact, he's already sort of thought of as a 2014 gubernatorial contender. He was completely unopposed, both in the primary and in the general election, so he skated right in. He's got himself a collection of about $2.5 million to run for whatever he chooses to run for next. And then the state comptroller, Peter Franchot, who's also a Democrat, faced some challenge in the general election with a guy named William Campbell, but was able to easily win re-election. So again, we remain a very democratic state, at least as far as state politics are concerned. There's some sort of optimism that Republicans can take from the local races, and we'll see how that plays out in the years to come. I'll be happy to take questions after Don.
I've got a little technology to play with here. Can you all hear me okay, or do I need to use the bad mic? Can you hear me okay? All right. I'll even yell if I have to, so that I don't have to reverberate. My message to you in terms of Maryland state politics is that a good Democratic candidate running a good campaign will beat a good Republican candidate running a good campaign statewide in Maryland every time. Every time. Why? The answer is that it's a numbers game. It's a huge numbers game. We are a very deep blue state. Party registration. You can see two things from these numbers. First of all, a huge Democratic advantage, and secondly, that the Democratic advantage has gotten bigger in every election cycle. The irony of Bob Ehrlich's 4 years as governor is that the Republican Party actually lost registrants during that period of time against the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party kept growing, the Republican Party kept growing, but the distance between the two in terms of registration kept getting greater. Julie pointed out that there are a lot of faux Democrats. There are a lot of Democrats who are in the party as registered voters so they can vote in the primary, but they're really independents or they're really Republicans, they're really conservatives who can't be relied upon to vote Democratic. That's true. But when you've got more than a 2-to-1 advantage, you can afford to lose some of those people. You can't afford to lose all of them, but you can afford to lose some of them. So a Democrat statewide starts out with a huge advantage in Maryland. It is a deep blue state. Part 2 of the numbers game. There are some jurisdictions, to paraphrase George Orwell, that are more equal than others. And they are Montgomery County, Prince George's, Baltimore City, and increasingly Charles County. Montgomery County, I just want to give you some population figures so you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about here. The Democratic jurisdictions, Montgomery, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Charles, Howard, and Prince George's, constitute 64% of the state's population. 2/3 of the state's population. And those are, for the most part, strongly to moderately Democratic jurisdictions. Montgomery County in 2002, 181,000 advantage to the Democrat, voted 61% Democratic, 62%, and in 2010, 68% Democratic. Prince George's, 77, 79, 88. Baltimore City, 75, 75, 82. Charles County, you can see that it's in red and then it switches over to blue. It switched over actually in 2008 for Barack Obama. And that's a function of demographics, population moving out of Prince George's County and out of Washington, D.C. into Charles County and flipping that county from Republican to Democratic. I want to talk about Baltimore County separately for just a second. Howard County is kind of a purple county, but it leans more Democratic. All of the Democratic incumbents in Baltimore County, or in Howard County, won this time at the local level. In fact, they pretty well trashed the Republicans in a Republican year when the Republican candidates who were running for county council and county executive really thought they had a chance. They got wiped, completely wiped out. But Baltimore County is the real interesting story in Maryland. It is the purplest county. It is one of the largest counties. It is 14% of the state population, 3rd in size. In 2002, Bob Ehrlich won that county by 65,000 votes, which was about his margin of victory against Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. 4 years later, Martin O'Malley lost that county, but only lost it by 8,500 votes and won by 120,000 statewide. This time, the county went, although barely, Democratic. It went by about 1,300 votes. So we've got a deep blue state. The big jurisdictions are very blue. One of them is purple. And if the candidate and the campaign can turn folks out, it makes a huge difference. In Baltimore County, the turnout this time was actually lower than the turnout 4 years ago. And that hurt Bob Ehrlich. His people didn't come out. All right, the 2010 election, O'Malley wins decisively. The numbers, okay, numbers, the registration numbers and where the votes are in the state explain a lot of that. We're also a liberal, affluent, well-educated state that didn't have a Tea Party effect. Marylanders have not gone for the Republican chant of lower taxes and less government. Apparently, we want governmental services. O'Malley campaigned hard and had money. I can't say enough about campaigns and the importance of campaigns, not just here but elsewhere, but particularly in this state. The argument has been all along that Bob Ehrlich was not serious about running, that he was kind of laid back. The rap on Bob Ehrlich is, if you don't mind me saying so, not my words, I'm repeating from other people, including the state Senate president, Ehrlich is lazy. That clearly showed in the campaign. It showed in his fundraising, it showed in his attendance of events and so on and so forth, and I think it showed in his overall attitude toward whether he was going to win the election or not. He started out with a very ill-advised strategy of going after votes in Montgomery County. Montgomery County is not going to give a lot of Republican votes. He then realized that that wasn't going to be a good strategy. It wasn't working out well. He wasn't resonating in that county. He moved back to Baltimore County, which is really the battleground county. Too late, too little, and he lost even Baltimore County, his home county. Money made a big difference as well. O'Malley had about, we don't know yet because we haven't seen the last reported figures, but O'Malley probably had about twice the amount of money that Ehrlich had, which meant he got to start early and advertise often. And he did that beginning in the spring, throughout the summer, and into the fall. And he did two kinds of ads. He did some really serious negative ads that painted Ehrlich, as the devil incarnate. And then he had some positive ads pandering to everybody who wants their kids to go to school and pay low tuition, and a variety of other ads like that. And those ads, I think, worked. Leaving me with the conclusion that a good Democratic candidate running a good campaign will beat a good Republican candidate running a good campaign every time. In this case, 2010, it was a mismatch because the good campaign was run by the Democrat, a poor campaign was run by the Republican. And the outcome is what it is. I don't anticipate that this is going to change for the foreseeable future, the next 2, 3, 4 election cycles. It wasn't true in 2002 because we had a weak campaign, a weak candidate, a very weak candidate, running an absolutely atrocious campaign. Hence, Ehrlich was able to win by, like I said, about 60, 65,000 votes. Other statewide races, Senator Mikulski won hands down. She will probably continue to win as long as she wants to run, however long that might be, and she will continue to clean up with large majorities. The poll numbers that came out, as Julie mentioned, early in the summer up until September, late September, the polls showed Ehrlich and O'Malley neck and neck. And then a Washington Post poll came out showing them between 11 and 14 points apart with O'Malley on top, followed by a Baltimore Sun poll showing about the same thing. A Rasmussen poll, which is a pretty Republican-leaning poll, showed Ehrlich down 8 points. The Gonzalez poll came out about in that same period of time, showing O'Malley up 5 to 6 points, but it overrepresented Republicans by several percentage points in the sample, and it underrepresented African Americans. So by the end of September, early October, it was pretty clear that this race was going to be a runaway. In January of this year, I did a an op-ed piece for the Baltimore Sun in which I predicted O'Malley would win based on these numbers by 6 points. Nobody thought he would win by 14, and it's very close to 14. His campaign was even flabbergasted that they won by 14. I want to talk about one other thing, and that is the national political situation, something that hasn't been mentioned but I think deserves to be mentioned. The question is, why were the independents so unhappy? Why did the independents want change? Clearly, there are a lot of objective things that both Stu and Tom talked about that make people unhappy. I think there's one subjective matter that we should not lose sight of. If you all remember when John Kerry ran against George Bush in George Bush's re-election attempt, he gave up the summer of 2004 to a group called the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth.
Yeah.
They changed the message as to who he was and what he stood for. And in my view, by not coming out and contesting the message from that organization, he lost the election. Probably too simplistic, but it had to have been a major factor. I think Obama and the Democrats gave up the message a year and a half ago. The Republican Party controlled the message to the voters, to the American citizens, about every aspect of what his administration was doing for close to a year and a half. And if you give up the message in an election campaign, you're going to get hurt pretty badly. So I'd be interested in hearing what Tom and Stu have to say about that. With that, I'm going to sit down and invite you all to ask questions.